You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. The Islamist group ISIS is continuing to make gains in Iraq as the Western world tries to deal with the violent group. On the weekend, the leader of ISIS declared a caliphate. This stretches across parts of northern Iraq as well as Syria. The conflict is being seen by some as a spillover from the civil war in Syria. There, the civil war has raged for 3 years, and the Syrian army, commanded by Bashar al-Assad, has, against all predictions, managed to stay steadfast. Many had predicted its demise, or at least its disintegration. But why have opposition forces in Syria been unable to topple it and Bashar al-Assad? Well, Kamal Alam is an analyst of the region and has written extensively about Syria. He was an advisor to the British Army on Afghanistan and Pakistan relations. And previously he worked at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. There he conducted research into groups like Hezbollah and the Taliban. He has just written an article for the website opendemocracy.net, where he outlines the history of the Syrian army, which he says goes a long way to explaining just why efforts to topple it have failed. I spoke to him and I started by asking him if the West had underestimated the Syrian army and why. I suppose what we're seeing almost 3 years on from the start of conflict in Syria is a very successful Syrian army. And you've written an article for Open Democracy called Pax Syriana, or at least headlined Pax Syriana, neither vanquished nor all conquering. Do you think that the West has underestimated the strength of the Syrian army, the organization of the Syrian army, and why do you think that is?
I think there was a massive rush to judgment when the Syria conflict began, that this is going to be like Libya or even Egypt and Yemen or Tunisia, where they will see a lot of people from the Syrian military, basically leaving and joining either the so-called revolution or rebellion and coming over to some of the groups that the West and the Gulf Arabs were supporting. And that hasn't happened because unlike the Egyptian army or the Libyan army, or the Yemen army, which never existed, the Syrian army has a very rich history of professionalism, which is a strong institution, which is multi-ethnic, which is multi-religious, completely non-sectarian. And the way the Syrian military was built in the last 40, 50 years, it cuts across the urban and rural divide. It brings together, the suave, urbane elements from the big cities like Damascus, Aleppo, Deir ez-Zor, Homs, Hama, and also took in the more rural, tribal nature of, the desert of Syria near the Iraq border, Jordan border. And they very successfully merged into a force which was a mixture of old Russian training, Arab nationalism, and also some of their officers were schooled even in Western military academies. So as a result, their exposure was to the Russian military theology, the Western military, and even in an Arab perspective, and they have held together very well.
Now, since Syria became independent, there have been quite a few army coups. So in terms of the fabric of the political society of Syria, they've both, I guess, acted against political forces and for them.
Absolutely. So when the French took over, what is now modern Syria, they built a very sectarian army. So the French built a very sectarian army which drew upon just the Christians, Alawites and Druze. However, once Syria became independent, the various coups that happened basically were a result of the instability that the French had left, behind them. However, in the mid-60s, you see a movement in the mid-60s and the late 60s leading up to Hafiz al-Assad. And actually, one could say that Hafiz al-Assad's, great genius military mind was he brought in a lot of the people who were outcasts in the beginning. And those, he brought in big Sunni players into the Syrian military. And, also he depoliticized the army. So although it became a one-party rule where everyone had to be a member of the Ba'ath Party, what he did was the bulk of the military officers were removed from political positions. So their main job was to protect Syria. Because again, we must realize Syria was facing multiple enemies. At the time, Egypt was destabilizing Syria because, Egypt and Syria had become one country under Nasser, and the Egyptians tried to use Syria as a colony, and the Syrians didn't want that. The Iraqis tried to do the same. And of course, you had the enemy, the main enemy, which was Israel, that they were fighting. So when they had three enemies which were destabilizing them, Hafiz al-Assad decided the most important thing to protect the territorial integrity of Syria would be to maintain the neutrality of its army.
How did he feel about the territorial integrity of Syria, given that it was drawn up under the Sykes-Picot Agreement and it was based on old imperial lines? Yeah. I suppose did he have the prospect of trying to invent a national identity out of these relatively arbitrary borders, and do you think he successfully did that?
Yes, again, so this is where I think history is very important. The Syrians know the sense of history of Damascus and Aleppo especially. Damascus is the oldest Arab capital. It was the seat of the first great Arab empire when it expanded all the way to Europe and Asia. So they had the identity of Syria, and that stemmed from Damascus and being the oldest Arab empire. And from there, obviously you had the Ottoman Empire and the European empires, and then obviously the fake borders that came through Sykes-Picot. And that's why you had pressure from France, Iraq, Israel to take parts of Syria away. And that's where he forged an identity with the military, where the military were tasked with not just protecting Syria, but also intervening in countries like Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, because if they didn't do that, the others would intervene in Syria, as the Egyptians and Iraqis were doing. So for Syria to survive, it had to be dominant in the region. Without big economic resources, they did become the big power in the region.
So Nasser's idea of a pan-Arab nationality wouldn't really have had that much impact on an army that was kind of fostered on the sense of Syrian identity.
Absolutely. In the beginning, people warmed to Nasser. Nasser was a great Arab hero, and he was supported, and that's why Syria joined into what became the United Arab Republic. However, some of the plans that the Egyptians were using Syria more to dominate Iraq and Lebanon. And, and a lot of senior Egyptian officers like Abdul Hakim Amer, who came to Syria, they started undermining Syrian military elite. And the Syrians were not going to have this. Because again, Nasser saw that Syria would be the key to controlling Lebanon and Iraq. So the geopolitical importance of Damascus came out. And that's where Assad and some of the other Syrian military leaders around him said, we've got to remove the Egyptian influence from Syria, otherwise Syria will cease to being Syrian. And that's what they did.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. I'm discussing the conflict in Syria and the role of the country's army in it. With me is the analyst and former advisor to the British Army, Kamal Alam. So was Hafez al-Assad's vision to recognise the multi-confessional nature of Syrian society? You mentioned Christians, Druze, and so on, and kind of almost use that as an asset, because having a sectarian-based army in such a multi-confessional society wouldn't perhaps work. Absolutely.
He used it to his great advantage, and I think that's the greatness of his vision, whereby, he knew that to keep Syria intact, you need a strong army. But to keep a strong army, you must please all the various confessions that live within Syria. The Christians, the Druze, the Sunni, the Alawites. And he gave them a sense of being Syrian. And that sense of being Syrian can be seen today in the military, where it is more important belonging to the Syrian Arab Republic Army than it is being a Sunni or a Christian or a Druze. And he did that successfully. The top officers were drawn from all the religions. The top military academies were in Hama and Homs, which are the Sunni heartland of Syria. And we could rise to the top. It didn't matter what religion or caste you come from.
So, in a funny way, he introduces meritocracy in a way that perhaps doesn't exist in other armies.
Absolutely, especially in the region. If you look at the region, especially the Arab countries around them, Iraq, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and some of the other smaller states, and look at the composition of their militaries, which is very, very, very divisive in their nature. For example, in the Saudi army, you can't rise to the top if you're not married to an Al Saud. The top officers come from 5 tribes. So in Iraq, Saddam Hussein, tried. I mean, of course, Saddam also was from the Ba'ath Party, although the Ba'ath Party had split. And the Iraqi army, had few people who were, especially from the Kurdish groups. You did have Christian officers in the Iraqi army and Shia officers, but not to the extent of the Syrian army, and the Jordanian army, again, the Jordanian army is simply an army that was built by the British officers, when it was Transjordan by Glub Pasha. And the Jordanian army's only job is to protect the king, it's not there. And the perfect example is in 1970, Black September, when Yasser Arafat and the PLO tried to overthrow the Kingdom of Jordan. It's the Pakistan army and the Syrian army that stepped in to protect Jordan. Otherwise, Jordan would have ceased to exist. So that explains to you that Jordan's own army couldn't protect it from the Palestinians. It needed Hafiz al-Assad and the Pakistan army to throw the Palestinians out. So
how did Alawites and Sunnis and Druze and so on feel about fighting alongside each other in the Syrian army? I mean, was that problematic to start with? I mean, or it was never an issue?
I think it was never an issue because of the rich history of Syria. They, loads of civilizations and come and gone there. Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Roman, Turks, Arabs. As a result, it was built up this, very, very peaceful nature of coexistence. And that's why it's important to learn from history. In the 1870s, when there was a massive civil war in Mount Lebanon between the Druze and the Christians, it was the Syrians from Damascus, who came in to make peace with the Christians in Lebanon. Of course, at that time it was Ottoman territory, but it was still what is now mostly Syrian Sunnis, Syrian Alawites, and Syrian Christians who brought peace to Lebanon. So they had this rich history of living and trying to live in peace. And of course, it hadn't been perfect like in any part of the world, but they learned to stick together and work through it.
So is it surprising that people tend to view Syria being run by an Alawite elite headed by Assad, and that I guess the impression is that the army is run along those kinds of lines? What you're saying is completely at odds with that perception. Do you think militarily that hasn't been taken and put into the equation in terms of how to deal with Assad's army?
Absolutely. I mean, when this conflict began, you'd see all these new experts that came up saying, oh, it's an Alawite government, it's an Alawite army, and it'll fall in a month or two. Even the Israelis, Ehud Barak, infamously said in 2 months, Syria will fall. And a lot of people said it'll fall because, it's an Alawite government. And there's absolutely no way a minority Alawite group, which is, less than 20%, can by force control Christians and Sunnis, because that just can't happen. It's not possible physically. And one of the reasons, and actually the world's best expert on Syria was a man called Patrick Seal. Patrick Seal was an Oxford academic from England who just passed away 2 months ago. And no one listened to his advice, When this conflict began 3 years ago, everyone knew he's the world's top expert. And I quote him in my research as well. He was immediately labelled as an Assad sympathiser just because he spoke the truth. He's an English academic from Oxford. Why would he be? He was a neutral, So people, I think there was a deliberate attempt in the West not to listen to people who knew their stuff. Patrick Seal is one example.
And what was he saying? What was his advice?
He was saying that we shouldn't alienate Assad, by making him the target and say we need regime change and it's an Alawite thing. The West is almost forcing, along with Saudi Arabia and Qatar, a sectarian war. Because by going out and giving out messages in the media which says this is an Alawite government controlled by Iran and Russia, you're giving out the message to a lot of people. Let's face it, most people don't know a lot about Syria because everyone lives their own lives. They don't know the intricate details. So when the media war began against Syria, this very soon became a sectarian war, which was imposed on Syria from countries like Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and unfortunately some Western countries helped in that.
So his advice was not to exclude Assad from talks, from the solution.
Absolutely.
He wasn't necessarily calling for arming of rebels or anything
like that.
No,
definitely not. He was also saying, don't use a negative narrative in the media, because we all know that we live in a world where the media, runs, so much influence in conflicts. We've seen that in the last 10 years, how important social media is. So when you use media as a tool to keep propagating a message of, oh, it's a sectarian government, this is happening, that's happening, whilst no one actually looked at the brutal facts of who were the generals, who were the defense ministers, who were the finance ministers, what was their makeup. And Patrick Seal was like, you have to go and work out a solution, work with the Russians, work with the Iranians, and learn from what mistakes you've made in Egypt, Libya, and Iraq.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. I'm discussing the conflict in Syria and the role of the country's army in it. With me is the analyst and former advisor to the British Army, Kamal Alam. What influence does Russia have on Syria, on Assad, and what influence does Iran have, either in material that it provides, training it provides? Is it overstated, do you think?
I think it is overstated. Of course, the historical linkages are there. The Russians were the biggest military suppliers to Syria for the last 30, 40 years. And, Iran also has a huge influence. However, the main reason Syria survives today in a majority is because of the Syrians themselves. Of course, you have international allies in Iran, Russia, and in China as well. There is military support, there's technical support, but you don't have heavy weapons, as some people have alleged that, the Russians are providing. A good example is the S-300, air batteries. They have not been provided to Syria, which are the latest Russian technology in shooting down jets. Even if you look at the air war, where the Turks and the Syrians have intercepted each other's jets and shot each other down, the Syrians have very obsolete planes, but they have a very highly trained air force with very good pilots who managed to shoot down Turkish jets. So it is overstated. Sure, the help is there. I would say the Russian and Iranian help is no more than, what the Turkish, American, or Gulf Arab help is to the rebels. It's not hugely significant.
So, from what you're saying, the strength of the Syrian army seems to suggest that they won't be defeated. Yeah. Is it what can the rebels take from that? Well, they're the insurgent groups and so on, those who oppose Assad. What would their tactic be? What would their next move be if it's an unwinnable war for them?
I think they, like I said, you had the chemical weapons attack last year, which, there is no intelligence either way to suggest who did it. But there are a lot of people out there. Seymour Hersh in the New York Times suggested it was perhaps done by Saudi and Turkish intelligence to preempt Western intervention, because the rebels know they cannot knock over the Syrian military. The only way they can remove that is if they have Western military intervention. The rebels themselves will not dislodge the Syrian army. In fact, we've seen the opposite, where some of the territory the Syrian rebels had taken, the Syrian military has slowly taken all those lands back and are taking them back. So realistically, the only way they would go is if you had heavy Western involvement. And the rebels are doing all kinds of atrocities and terrorist acts to instigate Western intervention. So,
to what extent is there spillover into Iraq and the march of ISIS? Now we hear the declaration the other day of a caliphate encompassing both parts of Syria and parts of Iraq. I suppose that's been discounted by many more moderate Muslims, or even Al-Qaeda themselves. Yeah. What a claim to make, a caliphate. But to what extent is Syria and the conflict there responsible?
Yes, some people say, that this is a direct spillover. And of course there are relations, and the spillover is there. No one can deny the fact that the conflict in Syria has also led to some of the problems in Iraq. But I think one of the main problems in Iraq has been that the Al-Maliki government has not been fully inclusive, of non-Shia groups. And again, it's an interesting parallel to Syria and Syria's army. The Iraqi army that was built actually by the Americans somehow just forgot to include the Arab Sunnis in the army, and because they de-Baathified the Iraqi army, they got rid of, the bulk of the Sunni Arabs in the army. The conditions were ripe for this kind of rebellion. And whilst the Syrians have been a calming influence, because the Syrians have been trying to tell Maliki, look, you've got to include the Sunni Arabs, because you've got to learn from us. There's no way we could have survived that, including everyone. But ISIS have been given a boost because, the Gulf Arab states see them as some kind of proxy. They might deny it, but, at the same time, the Saudi ambassador to the UK wrote a letter to the Daily Telegraph saying the West should not intervene in Iraq on ISIS. Let ISIS, so that letter, which came out a week ago, is a good indication that the Saudis don't want Western intervention, which is odd when you consider Saudi Arabia claimed to be fighting the war on terror, because if you don't want Western intervention in Iraq, as the Saudis are saying, that means in an indirectly way they're saying we're happy with what's happening in Iraq.
Aren't they at risk?
Well, they're definitely at risk, but, their officials...
So you're saying that there's an ulterior motive behind their desire not to have intervention?
Yeah, because I think they think, and this has been one of their policies, where they indirectly think that by having such a group in Iraq, it puts pressure on Iran. So, if you have Western intervention overnight and start bombing ISIS targets, then you have, then that's the end of that kind of movement. So it's more complicated than that. Of course, they're a direct threat to Saudi Arabia. And currently, Saudis rely on their own borders being protected by the Pakistan military. So Saudis don't rely on their own military in any way. So they see this threat emanating, and they've always tried to export their threats to other Muslim countries. They did it to Afghanistan, Pakistan, Chechnya, and they're now doing it to Iraq and Syria.
So just getting back to Syria and Assad's army, what role will he play and the Syrian army in combating ISIS, if any? Will he present himself as somebody who can actually fight ISIS, take on ISIS, or will he not? Will he stay silent on that?
In terms of ISIS in Iraq?
Yes.
Actually, the Syrian Air Force...
And ISIS in Syria.
Syrian Air Force has already been bombing ISIS targets in Iraq over the last 2-3 days, which is something Iraqis couldn't do because the Americans haven't provided the jets to the Iraqis, which they promised. Russian jets have arrived 2 days ago. So Assad has already taken a proactive role in fighting ISIS, even in Iraq.
Will he get credit for that?
I think he is getting credit for that in some way. The Iraqis have thanked him for it, and no one in the West will directly thank him for it. But actually, there are some people in the West who are now happy that, because, and this is where someone has to be brave in America or the European Union and reach out to Russia and Syria and say, we are willing to work with you on fighting this terrorist threat in Syria and Iraq, because this threat is now coming back to the West and Russia.
Is that likely, though? I mean, is that likely that Assad could play... he's playing a strategic game if he's helping tackle ISIS. It's for his own self-interest, but also he could present it as a way of saying, as a sop to the West, saying, look, I am helping.
Absolutely. And
take pressure off him. This
follows on from the chemical weapons, whereby Assad and Syria fully cooperated with the United Nations in removing chemical weapons. They've all been removed, as the UN says itself. And that, again, the Americans acknowledged that the Syrians cooperated on that. And that was him reaching out. He has again said he's willing to talk, and I think the Syrians have always been willing to talk and cooperate in all these issues. It's the Syrian rebels who have no say in Syria, who sit in Turkey and Doha, who refuse to negotiate because they want regime change. However, the Syrian government itself and the Syrian army has been very open to meeting with Western officials and working together. And they've already done this. They have a rich history. In the first Gulf War, the Syrians cooperated with America, part of the coalition of the willing that went to liberate Kuwait. So the Syrians have a legacy of working with the West, and they have reached out and said, we must combat terrorism together.
But there's no escaping that the West will want some kind of justice for the human rights abuses in Syria, for the hundreds of thousands of people who lie dead, and for the millions who have fled the country as well. And they blame Assad for that.
Absolutely. That's where I think you need skilled diplomacy coming to the table, where, they must sit on the table together and work out a solution which looks at aid, and it's been proven now that most of Western aid is being wasted because it's not being managed properly. Again, Syria has reached out and said any aid that must be delivered should coordinate through Damascus. At the moment, a lot of the billions of dollars have been wasted in Lebanon and Jordan because Jordan and Lebanon themselves keep half the percentage for themselves because they're poor economies. So, yes, I mean, there has to be an accommodation, as you ask, with some of the awful events that have happened in Syria. But that can only come through talk. And in Geneva, we saw that Assad had sent his A-team, to talk to the West about a durable solution. And actually, they came to a ceasefire in Homs. They evacuated a lot of the elderly and the women and the children and non-combatants. But of course, the way Syria's army looks at it, if someone's picked up a gun and fought against them, you can't negotiate with them because that's treason. And in any justifiable civilization and army, if you do treason against your army, you're taken to account for it. So
just finally, was there an anticipation that that some of Assad's army would desert, and why didn't they?
There was a massive anticipation that they would desert, and not just an anticipation. The West reached out, along with the Saudis, to try to bribe through millions of dollars for the top generals and officers to desert. And yes, you have had one or two notable defectees, but I would say 85% of the officer corps is still there. And that 85% that is still there, the reason they have not defected is they have a proud history, and that's what I try to say in my research and my work, that the Syrian military history is unlike other Arab armies because it's the only army that fought, non-stop for the rights of its people against Israel and against other countries who were a threat to Syria. So as a result, the Syrians grow up with this sense of history, and that's why they haven't defected. At the same time, if it was a sectarian army, you would have had a lot of senior Sunnis and Christians and Druze defecting. But, a lot of the senior generals and officials are actually Sunnis, Druze, Christians, which means they're an inclusive military. And that is why they have not deserted, because they know the alternative is Iraq or Lebanon, which are, unfortunately, just sectarian civil wars.
That was the analyst Kamal Alam speaking to me there about the Syrian army. This is the Voice of Russia in London. My name is Brandon Cole.